Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day. Welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Leon Tabak. I will moderate today's discussion. Our topic is making good on our promises. We want to talk about the challenges of paying for entitlements. This is a complicated subject that touches on many other important questions. We use this program to introduce you to engaging and informed and active, interesting members of our community, but we don't expect them all to be experts on our subject. I have with me today three people to help us in this conversation. Dr. Christopher Peters is in Coralville and has a clinic there, is that right? Do you want to say a little bit more about your work there?
Sure. I used to be a chest surgeon both at Mercy and Iowa City, and did some at one time up here in Cedar Rapids as well. And now I have a private surgical clinic, mostly taking care of people with venous disease. So I don't want to do a shameless plug unless you say I can. A corridor vein clinic if you have an interest. And yeah, live there, and two boys in college, one still in high school, and a wife and dog.
And of course you're engaged in public affairs in part because you've been a candidate for the House of Representatives to represent the 2nd District in the 2016 and 2018 elections.
It seems a long time ago already.
It does, it does. And then next we have also in the medical profession, Dr. Pete Damiano is a professor of dentistry and director of the Public Policy Center at the University of Iowa. So introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us how you mix these two different interests.
Right. So I started at the Public Policy Center almost 30 years ago in starting the health policy research program there, and then took over the center as the director about 11 years ago. And our primary mission at the Public Policy Center is to do multidisciplinary public research about public policy issues to try to inform policymakers and the public, and then share that information through our community engagement activities. We also have a strong student component. We have over 100 students that are employed by the Public Policy Center on research programs every year, and then we also support social science research. So we look at some of the more challenging public policy issues, from the environment to health to school, social and education policy, transportation, a variety of different issues, and kind of touch 50 different units all across campus.
And as director, you have your hands in many of these?
I have my hands in many of these, and yes, yes, it's a master of none, but yes.
And then Chris Krompart is a colleague of mine, a professor at Cornell College. I teach computer science at Cornell College, and Chris is across the walkway teaching politics for us. Tell us a little bit about your special interests in politics.
Certainly. So I teach courses in American politics, intro to American politics, but also courses like media and politics, campaigns and elections. So kind of a again, jack of all trades, master of none, maybe in American politics in terms of teaching. I conduct research, though, on decision making at the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as public opinion towards the Supreme Court, as kind of my area of specialty in terms of what I focus on.
Okay, so I'd like to frame our subject today. As I see it, the big challenge is, let's put some numbers on the table. There are about 326 million Americans. Our government is spending about $4 trillion a year. That's 4 trillions, that's 4 with 12 zeros after it. If we divided that equally among every man, woman, and child in the country, we're each owing about $12,000, more than $10,000 for that federal budget. Our government is borrowing about a quarter of what it spends each year now. And then we have some obligations beyond. We have a debt, which is about $20 trillion, about 5 times the federal budget. And then we have obligations beyond that. The country has made promises through Social Security and Medicare principally, and we can project how many people will reach the age of 65 in each of the coming years, and we can predict how much income will be flowing into those programs and how many benefits citizens will be claiming. And it doesn't balance. There's a large unfunded liability in these programs. We want to talk about how we're going to meet that. Are there some important numbers I've missed there, or is that, if I framed that well enough? The figures I've seen are a federal budget of $4 trillion, a debt of $20 trillion, and unfunded obligations that come somewhere in the neighborhood of 70, 80, 100 trillion, depending upon who's talking.
The only thing that I would
Right.
perhaps nudge a little bit, the unfunded part in terms of Medicare and Social Security, for example, there are no unfunded parts currently, right? We have a trust fund in which the payroll tax for those programs goes into. And so right now, those trust funds are solvent for Medicare for the next 9 years, for Social Security roughly for the next 18 years. And we're basically taking that money that's going into the trust fund, borrowing it back to the federal government to pay for the debt. It doesn't mean that there isn't a debt, but we're not in the hole on those two programs yet. But there's the concern that in the future, if we don't do something about it at some certain point, that there will be serious problems with the obligations for those two programs that are very important for a lot of people.
And I would say that Medicare is a little more difficult because we only have a trust fund for Medicare Part A, the hospital portion. There is no trust fund for B and Medicare Part D. So that's funded ongoing based upon tax revenue, mostly income taxes, that type of stuff, but not the payroll taxes. So, but beyond that, correct. 2034 is when it's estimated the combined Social Security trust funds for disability and survivors will be depleted. So by my count, that's about 16 years away, and we've known that deadline has been coming for decades, right? And it frustrates me as someone who did run for office and running with the intention of, here's some things we need to fix, and yet it doesn't seem like either a lot of times the people who vote and a lot of the elected policy makers don't really seem to be wanting to make a decision, as we were talking about earlier in the lobby.
Okay, before I move on to another question, I have a personal favorite question. I don't know if any of you will bite on this, but I'm going to try. I see a lot of accounting in this system that I think if it were a private insurance company would put people in jail. Is the trust fund real? I mean, Social Security can only invest in treasury bonds. That means it's lending money to other parts of government, which spend the money. Right. If you want to redeem those bonds, government has to get the money by taxing us. It's just, this is what Enron did. They shifted money from one division of the company to another.
Well, I mean, you're correct in that there is no real trust fund as I understand it. It really is almost like a pass-through into the securities, and then the government buys back those securities at a lower rate. I think the advantage of that in terms of, if you will, paying off the debt, it's rather than selling it to private equity firms or selling it to China or other places, we're sort of paying off the debt by borrowing from ourselves. Now, whether that makes or is a proper accounting principles or not, I think you could absolutely argue with. But you're right, there is no actual trust fund. There's no, and that's what a number of people are very upset about. There isn't sort of this pot of money that's there in case we would ever need it.
So Chris, this is sometimes, Social Security is sometimes called the third rail of American politics. Could you refresh our audience's memory of what a third rail is and why Social Security is the third rail here?
Well, we were talking about how this is a bit of an urban metaphor, and maybe being in Iowa, we need a rural metaphor. I don't have one on the top of my head. But essentially, you touch it and you're dead, so to speak, politically, because it is so popular, and it is so politically risky to propose reforms to something that is so popular, because changes to it, would they... I mean, it's something that is well known. People are comfortable with it as it is, and they might foresee that there's going to be problems with it. But, woe be to the politician who says that they're going to propose changes to this popular legislation, popular laws that have been around for a long time. Not just that they're popular, but they're also kind of fundamental to when we think about what the United States did in the 20th century and its legacy continuing into today. Do we want to make fundamental changes to something that is so emblematic of American policymaking? I think that is a risk that the typical politician, very understandably, doesn't want to wade into, because that's probably going to be a pretty lonely battle.
So some commentators on this subject point out that they argue that the public has an understanding of Social Security that is different than the creators of the program. And many people see this as their retirement income. They think of it as a kind of national pension or a kind of compulsory annuity, and that might not correspond to what the law says or what Congress intended more than 80 years ago in the case of Social Security. Does anybody want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that most people, and there have been surveys on that, I think it's something like 2/3 of people do understand that the money that they're going to receive in retirement is not money that's been saved up personally on their behalf, and that they are going to be receiving the proceeds of people who will be still working at that time. So I think the majority do kind of understand that, yet at the same time they still feel like they are entitled to that money, which is why we call it an entitlement, because they were compelled to donate donate. I guess that's a little too strong a term. You were compelled to pass along money in through a form of payroll taxes on a regular basis. The article that I passed along earlier, the Kurt Vonnegut quote,
Yeah, that's right.
got a hold of one of the speechwriters for Mondale way back in the 80s and said, it's the grandparents stealing from the grandchildren. I don't think it's stealing, I think that's a little strong a term, but we do have to realize that people that are in retirement now, including my father and including me in several years, are going to be drawing on the resources, the money that's being earned by workers in the future. And for me, that's part of the ethical perspective is here. What kind of burden are we placing on future generations? And it's a pretty significant one.
I think one of the things that you're alluding to is that it really was always meant to be one of the three-legged stool, if you will, of retirement. You were supposed to have a pension, you were supposed to have Social Security, and you were supposed to have personal savings. And it was going to be that safety net aspect. And I think what we've seen is that between Social Security and Medicare since, over the last 80 years, we've done a very good job of using those to protect seniors, to move them from one of the lowest income groups from an age category to one of the higher income groups. But what we've left with is still a disparity among seniors. So you have a lot of seniors who have a lot of money for whom Social Security really isn't that important in terms of their ability to survive, but then you've got another group of lower income seniors that it's critical. And the interesting thing I think about both of those programs from a political perspective is that the support for both is so strong because everybody is in it. And that's one of the things that makes it different from Medicaid and makes it different from many other social programs. And that's why it's very difficult to become a third rail, because everyone is in those programs. And so you've got the people who are politically connected, well off, and are going to be supported in the same way as the lower income seniors will.
So Chris, you are I presume, the youngest one of our group here. My privilege in life is to get a new senior discount with every birthday. So what do your peers say about this? So take yourself away from the political science classroom and just among people your age, what is their impression of Social Security, its future, what role it's going to play in your life?
I think, as you mentioned, some statistics at the outset, just in terms of these numbers that you hear, 12 zeros, and you're just baffled by it. This is for people that might even be closer to actually drawing on Medicare, drawing on Social Security. And so if you look at millennials such as myself, that is so much further down the line that it's difficult to conceive of it. And so I think that this is maybe a little bit more difficult for millennials to understand, but I think it's also part of the problem with addressing it is because we talk about 2026, we talk about 2034, these are still a long ways away, and while the stakes are very high, we might have more pressing problems, things that are creating a lot more attention or need a lot more attention today. So yeah, it's really just difficult to fathom even what Social Security would look like when I would draw upon it, if it's there. I mean, I personally believe that it would be there, but I think that is where people tend to go, is to think that with these problems, just to arrive at the conclusion, well, it's probably not going to be there in any way, shape, or form. I don't personally believe that, but I think that's understandable that people my age would think that.
Okay. So maybe we should we consider some of the ways the world has changed since 1935 and then how that's affected these programs. So I made a list and I'd invite you to comment on these. So in 1935-36, when Social Security was created, few Americans were getting college degrees. Many weren't even completing high school, so presumably 19 and 20-year-olds were working and paying taxes. And today, many young people not only go to college, but there might be a delay getting the degree, there might be an advanced degree, there might be an internship that doesn't pay very much. They might not be fully enrolled and into a career earnestly until they're well into their 20s. And then people live longer, right? And then they have smaller families, so there's fewer people in the younger generation to pay these bills. Now, on the other hand, we might retain our health longer and be willing to work to a later age. We might have work that isn't as physically demanding as it was in 1940 in some mill somewhere. So maybe we're willing to tolerate a later retirement age for that reason. So I've suggested several things there. Fewer people paying in as the generations are smaller. Maybe extending the retirement age. Other options are, you pointed out grandparents stealing from the children. So in previous decades, the beneficiaries took out of the system more than they paid in. That's not likely to be the case in the future. One way to get around this is to eliminate the cap on the amount of income that is taxed. So the benefits are capped and the amount of income taxed is capped to make this look like an annuity that you pay, you get out what you paid in. You might move away from that, and I'm interested in what the consequences might be. So I've given you a little spiel there. What do you have to say about that? Fewer young people. And we've talked about more immigration maybe tries to move that number of people paying in to number of people drawing out, move that ratio back in the right direction, raise the cap on the wealthy beneficiaries. Where do we go here?
Well, I'd say I agree with all those. I think you've got to check A, B, C, and D on those honestly. But Social Security was for a government program, probably one of the most sophisticated programs put together. One fatal error, however, is they presumed that the future would look much like the present at the time when it was passed. And you just pointed out all the ways that it doesn't. Something like 90% of the people worked in agriculture or labor industries at that point, and a fraction of a few percent do now. People are not only is the life expectancy grown, but more people are reaching 65 and then living longer and in better health, and declining birth rates, all the things you just mentioned, to the point that when I was born in 1960, there were 5 workers for every retiree. Now we're down to about 2.5 workers for every retiree. By 2034, when the trust funds are depleted, it's projected to be about 2 workers for every retiree. So that's an incredible burden on future workers as the way that I see it. And the solutions in the short term to deal with the baby boom, I'm at the tail end of the baby boomer generation. So there was this big surge where the pig in the python, as the model is commonly described. We're working our way through the python. But once we get through that, we're still going to have these long-term issues that have to do, again, with declining, getting married later, smaller families, all that stuff. How do you address it? Well, short term, you need to either raise taxes or you need to lower benefits somewhere. Both of those are distinctly unpopular. So take it from a former candidate for office. If I go around saying that, I'm not going to get a whole lot of votes based upon that, even though I know those are the only 2 choices. And it's probably going to be a combination of some of both. I personally would favor eliminating the cap on salary, on the payroll tax for Social Security. Currently it's tacked at, the cap I think is $128,400 for 2019. I would eliminate that. I would means test recipients, so wealthy people like my father. I don't think he necessarily needs Social Security benefits, so means testing that. Those seem to be really simple things, but again, it's the third rail, and people don't want to take strong stances if you're running for office. I think increasing immigration would be a great way to address it as well.
I think part of what you're talking about, you would change it from an entitlement to something that people would see as welfare. And I think that's one of the real challenges. And I'm not saying that that's good or bad in terms of as a policy, taking off the cap on Social Security. So my understanding, there is no cap on the Medicare portion, but
Correct.
there is on the Social Security portion. And if you were to eliminate that, then all of a sudden that sense that you are getting something back as you're getting, something close to what you've put in would then be gone. And I think that would undermine the support that you might see with Social Security across the board in terms of when you're talking about what would be the downside of some sort of a proposal like that. Do we ultimately have to do something like that? Yeah, we probably will have to do something like that, at least for a period of time, because you're talking about, it seems like forever, but getting through that bump in the python.
Once I'm dead, it'll all be fine.
Right, then it won't matter, right? But we get about 20 years further down the road, and then all of a sudden you have a change, and you don't have the same kind of problem that you're going to have over the next 20-year period, in theory at least, the way you're looking at the demographics of the country and the numbers. And then you'll probably, again, looking a little bit further out, you're going to have some issues again.
Yeah, at this point in time, I think that I don't see the will to do something now for it. I do think, though, that there's something to be said for looking at the early 80s when reform did take place. And pushed it almost right up to running out of money. But we saw Republicans and Democrats come together, and we saw major reform to Social Security in the form of making it later that you could apply for benefits, increasing payroll taxes. And so, hopefully it won't take as long to get there, but I do think we do have a precedent for this having worked in the past, and it involves Democrats and Republicans coming together, setting aside their issues. I think it would also be beneficial to not have too many cooks in the kitchen with this. And so if you were to have a bipartisan pair or a few people to come together with a proposal for this, and then to basically set the agenda, take it or leave it, if we could find some way to do that, preferably sooner rather than later, that's what I think would really need to be necessary in order to address this problem.
I think you kind of raised something when you think about it from a historical perspective. It's almost like we think that it used to be 50 years, and then it was 40 years, and then it was 30 years, and that's not the way it's been. At various different times, that trust fund looks like it's been solvent for 24 years, and then all of a sudden 8 years, and then 12 years because of different policies that we've done along the way. When the Affordable Care Act came in, it actually extended those trust funds for several years, both Social Security and Medicare trust funds. There have been policies that have been enacted, administrative policies over the last couple of years that have shrunk that back by a few years. And so often, as some people would say, it takes a crisis, to create a policy, and we might take us to get a little bit closer before we're willing to actually get together and do something. But it's not like it's been a consistent issue, that's just sort of been getting worse and worse. It's been changing over time.
So another changes that has happened over these last many decades is that fewer Americans have a pension from an employer. And where they do have a retirement program with the employer, it's less likely to be a defined benefit program. That is, it's unlikely to promise a fixed payment per month for the rest of your life. Instead, you have a pile of money that you're free to invest and divide up over the remainder of your life. Now, if we were able to get more Americans to a point where they were more secure in their own private financial situation and less dependent upon Social Security, maybe it would be easier to solve some of these problems. Are there things that the government could do there to promote that greater self-reliance, if you will?
Well, personally, I think that's a huge issue, and I think we've been moving in the wrong direction for the last 10 or 15 years, away from traditional pensions and more towards 401k type. At the same time, we've been seeing many corporations with record profits, and we've been, worrying more about sort of stock prices than the benefits. Now, at certain times, we've gone a little bit too far, maybe the other way on rich benefit packages. But as we do that, then it's going to increase the reliance on Social Security as we move away from a traditional pension plan. And there are definitely things the government can do to encourage that, and some of those we haven't been willing to do. There was a story just in the Washington Post the other day about the Marsh supermarket company that a private equity firm took under, basically paid off as investors, and then the pension plans were raided from the people who had been working there for decades. And that happens not infrequently. And if we don't protect those kinds of things, it will put more pressure on Social Security.
Yeah. What do you think, Chris?
I'm not sure. To be perfectly honest, like in terms of what the government could do, that we're moving away from pensions. One of the questions that you'd proposed, should the government more move into encouraging and in some way incentivizing private investment, and so creating a private account for individuals. And I know that this has had different political currency at different points in our history. I'm not sure if it's the right answer though, because I don't know how good the government would be at that, and if that's something that we should expect that the government should be doing. And so, for me, what would make more sense would be that if pensions traditionally come from employers, to place some sort of emphasis on reversing this trend that we've been observing. I'm not quite sure how we do that, but I think that when we talk about this three-legged stool, that you need to have that, otherwise it falls over. And so we need to do more to prop up pensions, and then maybe that takes more of the pressure off of something like Social Security that the government might be better at administering.
Okay.
Well, briefly, I know we're running out of time, but I don't see us reversing the trend away from defined benefit pensions. I think there is a really great model the government offers for federal employees called their Thrift Savings Plan, and making that available to people generally, basically investing in an index fund with a no load or minimal load up front. And the best way to save is just be putting money aside on a real regular basis and not paying too much attention to what you're investing in. And the Obama administration tried to do something along those lines with they called it a MyRA, an IRA for individuals, and that didn't pan out. It got closed last year.
Yeah, I've been amused, I think, to see my progressive friends who are big fans of the Scandinavian models, but Sweden introduced private accounts into its version of Social Security, and that's not popular with Americans on the left.
Well, I think it depends, again, it doesn't have to be an either or, right?
Okay.
I mean, and I think that's the whole idea. You want a diversified portfolio between savings, pension, and Social Security. And it's just if we take away from people's saving, the pension part of that, then the Social Security becomes more important. And as we're talking about, then that becomes very problematic because of the inverse pyramid of the population base to support it.
Okay, so we're down to our last couple of minutes, so you might want to think if there's a message you want to share with our audience in parting. I see this as a problem. I think it's important to think of this as not just a Social Security problem or a Medicare problem or an American problem. This is a problem around the world. Corporate pensions are challenged, state pensions are challenged, and we see this demographic change in other countries as many nations are now going to have a very large fraction of the population that's over 65. Oh, any last words here, Chris?
Yeah, so I mean, the scope of our problems, we shouldn't understate them, especially with the graying of America, so to speak. But we've faced these challenges before, and like I mentioned with the early 80s before, and we solved them then, maybe not for a long time, but we can address these. We've done these before, and to do it in a way that doesn't compromise the fundamental nature of something like Social Security or Medicare, I think that that's what's important, and some of the risks that could be associated with it. So keeping in mind that identity and sticking with it.
Okay, we're down to our last few seconds here.
And I think trust in government comes with the trust in these two programs, and figuring out how to make these solvent and make people feel comfortable with them is very important.
My focus now, as it was when I campaigned, is what we're leaving behind for future generations. I think we're leaving a mess, to be honest, and we need to start addressing it.
Thanks for being with us today, and we hope to see you again on another edition of Ethical Perspectives on the News. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.